Imagine this. It's April 26th, 1986. You're thousands of miles away from Chernobyl. Maybe you're getting ready for work. Maybe you're watching television. Maybe you're spending time with your family. Whatever you're doing, it feels like a normal day. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, a nuclear reactor has just exploded. The people closest to it don't fully understand what's happened yet. The city next door is still asleep, and radioactive material is already rising into the atmosphere. One of the worst nuclear disasters in history is unfolding in real time. Most of the world has absolutely no idea. And one of the strangest parts? Before they tried to explain what happened, they tried to hide it. The deception was only exposed 2 days later when Swedish monitoring stations detected abnormally high levels of wind transported radioactivity. But Chernobyl wasn't just a cover-up. It wasn't just a reactor explosion. Because hidden inside the disaster was a mystery that still sounds impossible. The emergency shutdown button was supposed to stop the reactor. At Chernobyl, it helped finish the job, which is a problem, because a shutdown button has one job. You press it, the scary machine stops doing the scary thing. At Chernobyl, the opposite happened. It'd be like pulling a fire alarm and discovering the sprinkler system had secretly been replaced with gasoline. Inside Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the emergency shutdown system did something no one in that control room expected. It made the reactor worse. And the strangest part is that this did not start with a bomb, or sabotage, or some villain dramatically pulling a lever while lightning flashed in the background. It started with a safety test, a routine test, the kind of test that sounds so boring, you almost trust it automatically. Let's get right to the point. Chernobyl was not one bad button press. That would almost be comforting. One mistake means you can point at one person, one lever, one terrible decision, and say, there, that is where everything went wrong. But Chernobyl was not that simple. Chernobyl was a stack of problems. One problem on top of another problem on top of another problem until the whole thing became a leaning tower of nuclear disaster, and the final push came from the one thing that was supposed to save it. So to understand how a routine test caused the worst nuclear accident in history, we have to start at the strangest part. Chapter 1. The button that made things worse. Imagine there is a giant red button on the wall, not a decorative button, not a please do not press this button that makes people immediately want to press it, a real emergency button, the kind that has an eerie sense of purpose, the button that says, enough nonsense, everybody stop touching the machine. At Chernobyl, that button was called AZ5. When pressed, it was supposed to insert control rods into the reactor core. Control rods are basically the reactor's brakes. They absorb neutrons, slow the chain reaction, and bring the reactor under control. That is the normal idea. Scary machine gets unstable. Operator presses shutdown. Control rods go in. Reactor stops having a temper tantrum. Everyone breathes, wipes the sweat off their forehead, and writes a report that uses the word incident way too casually, but that is not what happened. During the final seconds before the explosion, the operators pressed AZ5 exactly as they were instructed to, and instead of instantly saving the reactor, the shutdown system helped trigger a final power surge. That sounds fake. It sounds like saying the fire extinguisher briefly became a flamethrower. But under the exact conditions inside Reactor 4 that night, the control rods had a dangerous flaw. They were not simple neutron-absorbing rods from top to bottom. The lower part included graphite displacers. And in this reactor, under those conditions, graphite could increase the chain reaction. So when the rods first moved down, they pushed the water that had been absorbing neutrons out of the lower part of the core and replaced it with graphite. For a few seconds, the shutdown system added reactivity before the neutron-absorbing material could fully do its job. The easiest way to picture it is this. Imagine you are driving downhill. The car is already moving too fast. You slam the brakes. But for the first second, the brake pedal nudges the gas. Not forever. Not even for long. Just long enough to matter. Inside Reactor 4, long enough was only a few seconds. Make of that statement what you will. That is the mystery at the center of Chernobyl. The operators did not ignore the emergency shutdown system. They used it, which means the real question is not, why did they press the button? The real question is, how did the reactor become so unstable that the safety button could make everything worse? To answer that, we have to rewind. Chapter 2, The Boring Test. The night shift at Chernobyl was not trying to invent a new kind of disaster in a lab coat. They were trying to answer a dull electricity question. The question was simple. If the power failed, could the spinning turbine keep the cooling pumps running long enough for the backup diesel generators to take over? That is it. That was the big, scary test. Not, can we make the reactor go crazy and see what happens? Not, what if we poke the nuclear bear? Just this, if electricity fails, can the cooling pumps keep running for a short time? Because a nuclear reactor is not like an engine. When you turn off an engine, it stops what it's doing. A reactor does not. Even after shutdown, the fuel keeps producing heat. The core still needs cooling, because nuclear fuel does not clock out right at 5 o'clock. So the engineers wanted to know if the turbine could help during the gap. Picture a bicycle. You stop pedaling, but the wheels keep spinning for a little while. That leftover spin is called coast down. The test asked whether the plant could use the turbine's leftover spin to keep the pumps alive just long enough for the diesel generators to start. On paper, that sounds responsible. It sounds like exactly the kind of question people at a nuclear plant should be asking. But here is where the story starts getting weird. On paper, this was an electrical test. Inside the core, it became a nuclear test. And the reactor did not care what the paperwork called it. It was like cutting your main parachute just to test the backup while you're already falling. The test had been attempted before. It had not produced the results they wanted. So they planned to try again during a scheduled shutdown of Reactor 4. The reactor was going to be shut down for maintenance anyway. So someone basically said, great, while we are turning it off, let's run the test. Which sounds efficient. And efficiency is great, right up until it starts making decisions that safety should have made. Because the test was not happening in an empty spreadsheet. It was happening inside a massive nuclear reactor that needed 3 things to stay safe: cooling, control, and a clean plan. Chernobyl was about to lose all 3, but the first thing to go wrong did not look like a reactor problem. It looked like a scheduling problem. Chapter 3, the delay that changed everything. The test was supposed to happen during the day on April 25th. That matters, because during the day, the crew was prepared. People knew the plan. The test team was there. The shift had been briefed. The whole thing was supposed to happen inside a controlled window, which is exactly where you want a nuclear test to live. But then the power grid still needed electricity. Another power source was unavailable, so the grid controller told Chernobyl to keep producing power longer than expected. So, Reactor 4 stayed online. Not for a few extra minutes, for hours. And this is one of those moments in disaster stories where nothing looks dramatic yet. No alarms, no smoke, just a delay. A boring delay, the kind every workplace understands. Can you stay a little longer? Can we push this back? The plan changed, but we are still doing the plan. And somehow, those are the words that should make everyone nervous, because machines do not always wait politely. A nuclear reactor has internal conditions that keep changing whether your plans got moved or not. The reactor was held at reduced power for hours, and low power in this kind of reactor was not a nice, peaceful nap. It was more like the reactor sitting quietly in the corner, becoming annoying in a way nobody could see yet. By the time the test resumed after midnight, the original prepared shift was no longer the main crew handling it. The night shift had inherited the job. If you have ever walked into work and immediately been handed someone else's complicated problem, you know the feeling. You are not starting from calm. You are starting from, okay, what did you people do before I got here? Inside the control room were people whose names matter. Anatoly Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer supervising the test. Alexander Akimov was the unit shift chief. Leonid Toptanov was the young reactor control engineer at the panel. These were not cartoon villains. They were not rubbing their hands together saying, tonight, we make history. They were people in a control room, late at night, trying to finish a test that had already been delayed, inside a machine that was much less forgiving than they understood. And that is important, because the lazy version of Chernobyl is, some reckless operators blew up a reactor. The real version is more uncomfortable. The operators made dangerous choices, but they made those choices inside a system that punished them in ways they were not fully warned about. That is a different kind of scary. One is human error, the other is human error inside a trap. And by the time the night shift took over, that trap had already started setting itself. Inside the reactor, something invisible was building up. Chapter 4, the invisible poison. While Reactor 4 sat at low power, the core started filling with Xenon 135, which sounds like the name of a rejected science fiction villain, and honestly, that would have been easier to deal with, but Xenon 135 is not visible. It is not dramatic. It does not glow green. It does not stand in the control room with a set of demands and a master plan. It just quietly absorbs neutrons. And neutrons are what keep the chain reaction going. So, if neutrons are running around saying, keep the party going, Xenon is the bouncer standing at the door saying, not tonight. The reactor looks sluggish. The power is too low, and the operators still need to finish the test. So, what do you do when the reactor will not rise back up? You remove some of the things holding it back. That means pulling out control rods. Again, inside the room, this did not feel like madness. It felt like recovery. The reactor is too low, the test needs power, the Xenon is holding the reactor down, so you pull out rods to bring it back. But control rods are the brakes, and every rod pulled out meant fewer brakes left inside the core. That is the cruel trick. The reactor looked sleepy, but it was sleepy in the way a hibernating bear is sleepy. Quiet does not always mean safe. Sometimes quiet means the problem has not announced itself yet. The operators eventually brought the reactor back up, but only to a low level compared with the original test plan. The safer answer would have been simple. Stop. The conditions are wrong. The reactor is unstable. Try again another day. But pressure does not always walk into a room and scream. Sometimes it just sits there. It looks like a schedule. It looks like a supervisor. It looks like a test that already failed before and needs to be finished. It looks like people thinking, we are already here. By this point, the reactor had lost a lot of its safety cushion, but the weirdest danger was still ahead. Because even without the Xenon, even without the delay, even without the rods being pulled out, Reactor 4 had a design behavior that mattered more than almost anything else that night. Under the wrong conditions, it could start feeding its own problem. Chapter 5. The brakes came out. Pulling out control rods is not automatically insane. It is part of how operators run a reactor every day. The problem at Chernobyl was not that the rods moved. It was the situation they were moving in. Poisoned by Xenon, power too low, a test that still needed to happen. So more rods came out. Then more. And from inside the control room, every one of those choices felt like solving the immediate problem. The reactor is too low. The test needs power. The rods are holding it back. So, pull them out. That is how humans get trapped sometimes. We solve the problem directly in front of our face, while a bigger problem quietly waits for us to notice them. Because every rod that came out gave the operators more power, but less safety margin. Eventually, Reactor 4 was operating in a condition where far too many control rods had been withdrawn. The exact numbers get technical, but the important part is simple. The reactor did not have enough braking power already inside the core, and that mattered because control rods do not move instantly. They are physical objects. They have to travel down into the reactor. This is not a video game where you press a button and the entire core says, understandable, have a nice day, and then shuts down. The rods take time to insert, and time is exactly what the reactor was about to stop giving them. This is where the whole story becomes less like a test and more like a room slowly losing exits. The operators had not blown anything up yet. The control room was still standing, the panels were still panels, the lights were still lights. People were still doing procedures, the reactor was still reactoring. But underneath all of that, the reactor's safety cushion had been carved away. The machine still looked controllable. That was the problem. A disaster is most dangerous right before it becomes obvious. Because right before it becomes obvious, people can still convince themselves they are managing it. And the operators were trying to manage a reactor with fewer brakes than it needed. Poisoned by Xenon, sitting at low power, late at night, under pressure to finish a test. That is already bad. But it still does not fully explain why the reactor went from unstable to destroyed. For that, we need to talk about Reactor 4's most dangerous instinct, because under the wrong conditions, this reactor could respond to danger by making more danger. Chapter 6, The Reactor with Backwards Instincts. A good safety system should have boring instincts. That is what you want. If something gets too hot, it should calm down. If pressure rises, it should release safely. Many reactor designs are built so that when certain things go wrong, the reaction naturally slows down. That is a good instinct. That is the machine equivalent of touching a hot pan and immediately deciding, actually, I will not keep doing that. But the RBMK reactor at Chernobyl could behave differently under dangerous conditions. It had what is called a positive void coefficient. Inside the reactor, water flowed through channels around the fuel. That water cooled the reactor, but it also absorbed some neutrons, so the water was doing two jobs. It was cooling the core, and it was acting like part of the brake. Now, when water gets hot enough, it boils. Boiling creates steam bubbles. Those steam bubbles are called voids, and here is the ugly part. In this reactor, under the wrong conditions, when water turned into steam, there was less water available to absorb neutrons. Less neutron absorption meant more reactivity. More reactivity meant more power. More power meant more heat. More heat meant more boiling. More boiling meant more steam. And more steam meant even more reactivity. That is not a safety feature, it is a feedback loop, like putting a microphone next to a speaker. At first, there is a tiny sound. Then, the speaker plays the sound. Then the microphone hears the speaker. Then, the speaker makes it louder. Then, the microphone hears that. and suddenly everyone in the room is making the same face. Except inside Chernobyl, the feedback loop was not a terrible noise at a school assembly. It was power rising inside a nuclear reactor. This is why the low power condition mattered so much. The RBMK could run safely under normal operating conditions. But that night was not normal. The reactor was at low power. The core was poisoned by Xenon. Too many control rods had been pulled out. Coolant flow was about to change. Safety systems had been limited for the test. And the reactor had a design behavior where more steam could create more power, which could create more steam. That is the kind of loop you never want in a machine that contains nuclear fuel. And this is where blaming only the operators becomes too easy. Because yes, the operators made dangerous choices, but a safer design would have given them more room to make a mistake. A safer system would have said, no, you are too close to the edge. We are stopping now. Instead, Reactor 4 had a cliff built into the fog, and the fog was about to get thicker. Because the test had paperwork. It had a plan. It had steps. It had switches and procedures and official seriousness. But official seriousness does not mean the plan is safe. Sometimes it just means the bad idea has been formatted nicely. Chapter 7, The Checklist Problem. People love checklists because checklists feel like control, and to be fair, checklists save lives. Pilots use them, doctors use them, engineers use them, but a checklist has one weakness. It can make a dangerous situation feel organized, and organized danger is still danger. The test at Chernobyl had steps, it had electrical goals, it had people watching panels, it had official approval, it had enough seriousness around it to make a clipboard feel important, but the basic question kept getting buried. Should this test still be happening right now? Not in the original plan, not in the version imagined earlier that day. Right now, with this crew, at this power level, with this reactor condition, with this many control rods withdrawn, with safety systems limited so the test would not cancel itself. That is the question that should have been screaming in the room. But systems are weird. Once a plan exists, people start treating the plan like it has gravity. The plan pulls people forward, even when the situation changes, even when the plan no longer matches reality. Everyone knows this feeling in smaller ways. You make a plan to go somewhere, then it starts raining, then traffic gets awful, then your phone is dying, then the place is probably closing soon, and somehow your brain still says, well, we already left. That is fine when the worst consequence is a disappointing sandwich. It is less fine when the plan involves a nuclear reactor. At Chernobyl, several automatic protections were disabled or blocked as part of making the test possible. You heard that correctly. Several automatic protections were set aside for testing. That sounds insane when you say it quickly. But again, this is how danger becomes normal. A protection trips too early and ruins the test. So someone says, we need to prevent that from interrupting the test. And in one narrow sense, that makes sense. The test cannot happen if the system keeps stopping it. But that is also the whole point of some safety systems. They stop things. They are the annoying friend who says, I'm not leaving till everyone has a seatbelt on. Nobody loves that friend in the moment. Then later, everyone agrees that friend had a point. The test was supposed to prove the plant could handle a power failure, but by this point, the safest result would have been no result at all. Stop the test. Try again later. Let the reactor settle. Instead, they kept moving forward. They were testing safety while walking away from it. The reactor needed cooling, control, and a clean plan. Cooling was about to be disturbed. Control had been weakened, and the plan had been dragged through a delay, a shift change, a poisoned core, and a low power recovery. But because the checklist still existed, the task still felt real. Finish the test, get the data, complete the shutdown, move on. That is how paperwork becomes dangerous. Not because paperwork is evil. Paperwork is just paper. The danger is when the paper version of reality becomes more convincing than the actual reality. And the actual reality was this Reactor 4 was unstable. The crew did not fully understand how unstable, and the machine was about to be pushed into the exact kind of condition where its worst instinct mattered most. So after all the delay, all the adjustments, all the rod movements, and all the quiet warning signs, the test finally began. Chapter 8, the test begins. It is now after 1 in the morning. The control room still looks normal. Panels, switches, gauges, tired men watching numbers move. That is what makes this moment so uncomfortable. The disaster has not become loud yet. It is still hiding inside the instruments. The control room did not suddenly transform into a volcano. It was still a room. At about 1:23 in the morning, the turbine stop valves were closed. That was the start of the test. Steam to the turbine was cut off. The turbine began coasting down, and for a moment, that was exactly what they wanted. The turbine was still spinning. The pumps connected to it were still getting power. The test was finally happening. After all the delay, after all the low power problems, after all the fighting with Xenon, finally, the boring question was being answered. Could the leftover spin keep the cooling pumps running? But inside the reactor, the answer was becoming dangerous. As the turbine slowed, the pumps began to slow. As the pumps slowed, coolant flow changed. As coolant flow changed, water in the core could boil more easily. And in this reactor, more boiling could mean more steam bubbles. More steam bubbles could mean more reactivity. More reactivity could mean more heat. And now, the loop was awake. This is the moment where the machine starts quietly feeding itself. Not with fire, not with explosions, with steam, tiny empty spaces in water. That is almost insulting. You expect the villain of the story to be dramatic. A giant crack in the floor, a red alarm, a screen flashing the word danger like it has a flair for theater. Instead, the villain is bubbles. Little pockets of steam forming where water was supposed to help keep the reaction under control. And because the reactor had already lost so much safety margin, those bubbles mattered. Power began to rise. At first, maybe that still looked manageable. That is another cruel thing about complicated systems. There is often a tiny window where the problem is real, but it has not yet become honest. The instruments move. The operators react. The room still feels like a room, but the system has already turned a corner. It is like watching a glass roll toward the edge of a table. For most of the trip, nothing has technically broken. The glass is still fine. The table is still fine. Everyone can still pretend this is recoverable. Then the edge arrives. Inside Reactor 4, the edge was coming fast. Seconds were starting to matter, not minutes. Seconds. The operators saw the power rising. The situation was slipping, so the decision was made to shut the reactor down. A Z5. The emergency shutdown button. The stop button. The button that exists for exactly this kind of moment. It was pressed. The control rods began moving into the core. And in a normal story, this is where the machine calms down. This is where the reactor says, "Fair enough." This is where the system works. But Chernobyl was not in a normal story. The rods started moving. The lower graphite displacers moved into the bottom of the core before the absorber sections could fully take over. Reactivity increased where the reactor was already vulnerable. The brake pedal briefly touched the gas, and now the disaster had outrun the room. Chapter 9, Seconds to Destruction. After AZ5 was pressed, the reactor did not calm down. It surged, and this is where human reaction time became useless. People are built for problems that move at human speed. A fire spreads, a car skids, a glass falls from a table. You get a moment to understand what is happening. Reactor 4 did not give them that moment. Inside the core, power began rising faster than the room could keep up with. Fuel channels ruptured. Steam pressure spiked. The control rods could not finish inserting. The machine had entered a state where the people pressing buttons were no longer controlling the story. They were just helplessly inside it. And this is important. Chernobyl was not a nuclear bomb. A reactor cannot explode like a nuclear weapon. That distinction matters because otherwise the whole story turns into cartoon science, where anything with radiation becomes the same green glowing bucket of danger. What happened at Chernobyl was different. It was a runaway reactor accident. Power surged. Water flashed into steam. Pressure tore through the reactor. The core was shattered open. Radioactive fuel, graphite, metal, and debris were thrown into the night. That is still horrifying. It just matters to be horrified accurately. A violent explosion tore through the reactor. Then another blast followed. The roof was ripped wide open. The top of the reactor was destroyed. And suddenly, the most dangerous part of the plant was exposed to the air. 1 second, there was a reactor inside a building. The next second, the building was no longer doing the main thing buildings are famous for, containing what is inside them. In the control room, the operators were trying to understand something that sounded impossible. The reactor was destroyed. But that is not a normal thought. Your brain does not want to accept a sentence like that. If you work at a nuclear plant and the building shakes, your first thought is not, the core has launched itself into the open air. Your brain reaches for smaller explanations. A tank exploded. A pipe burst. A pressure system failed. Something terrible happened, but surely the reactor is still there, because the alternative is too big. Too impossible, too final. So people kept acting like there was still a reactor to save. They tried to pump water into it. They sent workers into dangerous areas to check damage. They looked at radiation meters that could not read high enough, and because the real number sounded impossible, some people trusted the low readings. That is one of the cruelest parts of the story. After the explosion, the system kept asking people to behave as if the system was still understandable, but it was not. The building was broken, the instruments were limited, the air was contaminated, the roof was burning, pieces of the reactor core were lying outside, and men were walking through it because they had been trained to respond to emergencies, not to accept that the emergency had become something almost beyond imagination. Alexander Akimov and Leonid Toptanov stayed involved in the response. They had been part of the control room during the test. They had made choices that mattered, but after the explosion, they also tried to help. They helped work on getting water into the damaged reactor. They went into areas no human body was built to survive. Both would later die from radiation exposure. That is why the simple blame story falls apart. People want Chernobyl to be clean. One villain, one idiot, one button, one lesson. But real disasters are messier than that. Chernobyl gives you people making mistakes, people following pressure, people trying to help, people hiding information, and a machine with flaws the people closest to it did not fully understand. That is harder to summarize. But it is much closer to the truth. And while the control room was still trying to understand what had happened, another group of people was arriving outside. Firefighters. They thought they were coming to fight a fire. They did not know they were walking into an open nuclear core. Chapter 10, The City That Didn't Know. Firefighters arrived at Chernobyl because that is what firefighters do. A building is on fire. Someone calls, they go. That part is simple. The part nobody told them was that this was not a normal fire. This was not a kitchen fire, or a warehouse fire, or even a regular industrial fire, where the danger is heat, smoke, collapsing metal, and the general problem of everything being on fire. This was an open nuclear reactor. Pieces of the reactor core had been thrown onto the roof and around the building. Graphite blocks were scattered like strange black rubble. Metal was twisted, concrete was shattered, the roof was burning, and the air itself was dangerous. But radiation does not look like anything. That is one of the reasons this story is so hard to process. If a monster walks into the room, everyone agrees the monster is there. Radiation gives you no scene like that. No growl, no shadow, no warning label floating in the air. It just exists. Invisible. Silent. Unbothered. So the firefighters climbed toward danger they could not see. To them, the black chunks on the ground looked like debris, which they were. But they were also pieces of the reactor, and that meant some of the wreckage was giving off radiation so intense that standing near it could change the rest of someone's life, or end it. Radiation poisoning doesn't just make people sick, it damages the body's ability to repair itself. Cells die faster than they can be replaced. Organs begin to fail. And the cruel part is that this can happen while a person is still awake, talking, and hoping they will recover. One of the firefighters was Vasily Ignatenko. He was young. He had a wife. His job that night was not to become part of a history lesson. It was to respond to a fire. That is what makes this part so heavy. History has a way of turning people into examples. But in the moment, they are not examples. They are tired. They are confused. They are doing the job in front of them. They are thinking about hoses, ladders, smoke, where the flames are spreading, and whether the roof will hold. Not, I am standing beside the exposed remains of a nuclear reactor. Because who thinks that? Who has that sentence ready in their head? The firefighters fought the flames on the roofs and around the plant, and in one sense, they were incredibly successful. They helped stop the fire from spreading to other parts of the station. That mattered. Chernobyl was not one lonely reactor sitting in a field. Other reactors were nearby. More systems, more buildings, more ways for the disaster to grow. So the men on those roofs were not just victims walking into a scene. They were doing something important, but they were doing it without being given the full truth of what they were facing, and that is the pattern that keeps repeating. People are asked to act, but they are not given reality. They are given a smaller version of reality. A version the system can handle. A version that fits the paperwork. A version that does not make everyone panic. But reality does not get smaller because officials are uncomfortable. Only a few kilometers away, Pripyat was still there. Apartment blocks, schools, playgrounds, kitchens, elevators, beds, the everyday stuff that makes a city feel normal. And that is what makes Pripyat so haunting. It was not built to be a ghost town. It was built to be a model city, a place for workers and families, a place where people got married, raised children, bought groceries, waited for buses, complained about weather, and probably forgot where they put their keys, like everyone else. Then one night, a reactor exploded nearby. and for hours, life did not fully stop. Some people saw a strange glow from the plant. Some went outside. Some watched from balconies. Some had no idea what they were looking at. And again, that is the terrible power of invisible danger. If a wall of water is coming toward your city, you run. If fire is coming down the street, you run. If an army is approaching, you might hear it. But radiation can arrive while the sidewalks still look normal. The trees are still standing. The buildings are still there. The morning still comes. People wake up. Children exist in the world the way children do. Completely uninterested in reactor, physics, and government failure. And the adults around them are trying to understand why officials are not explaining more. This is where Chernobyl becomes more than engineering. It becomes trust. Because after the explosion, the Soviet system did what closed systems often do when reality becomes embarrassing. It hesitated, it minimized, it tried to control the story before admitting the truth, and you can understand the logic, even though the logic is awful. If officials announce the real danger immediately, there is panic. There are questions. There is blame. There is international humiliation. There is proof that the supposedly safe and powerful system has failed in the most public way imaginable. So instead of truth moving fast, bureaucracy moved slowly. And bureaucracy is already slow when it is doing something normal, like approving a form or deciding which room gets a new chair. Now imagine bureaucracy trying to process an exploded nuclear reactor. That is not a machine built for speed. The evacuation of Pripyat began on April 27th, the day after the explosion. Buses arrived. Not one bus, not a few, a line of buses, a whole moving wall of them. People were told to take what they needed for a short time. That detail is devastating, because when someone says, "You will be back soon," you pack differently. You do not empty your life into a suitcase. You do not take every photograph, every toy, every letter, every dish your grandmother gave you. You take clothes, documents, maybe food, maybe medicine. You close the door because you expect to open it again. That is the image that stays, not the reactor, not the explosion, but a person closing an apartment door and believing they will open it again. Behind that door are cups in the cabinets, shoes by the wall, a calendar on the table, a child's toy on the floor. Normal life paused, except the pause never ends. Pripyat was evacuated, then a wider exclusion zone was created. People from surrounding villages were moved too. Homes emptied, fields abandoned, pets left behind, and that part is almost too ordinary to handle. Because the big disaster is made of small losses, the house you do not return to, the street you cannot walk down again, the neighbor you never see in the same way, the school that still has desks but no students. The city does not disappear, it remains. That is worse. It just stops belonging to the people who lived there. And while Pripyat was being emptied, the outside world was beginning to notice something was wrong, not because Soviet officials immediately gave a clear announcement, but because radiation does not respect borders. A nuclear accident is very rude like that. It does not wait for a press release. Radioactive material traveled through the air. Monitoring stations in Sweden detected unusual radiation. At first, workers at a Swedish nuclear plant thought the problem might be there, but it was not there. The contamination had come from somewhere else. Eventually, attention turned toward the Soviet Union, and only then did the world begin to learn that something terrible had happened at Chernobyl. That is one of the most absurd and frightening parts of the story. The disaster was so large that it announced itself internationally before the government fully announced it honestly. Imagine messing up so badly that another country's radiation detectors basically say, "Hey, did you lose a nuclear reactor?" That is darkly funny for about half a second. Then it becomes horrifying, because it means the people closer to the disaster had been living inside missing information, and missing information can be deadly. But even after the evacuation, the disaster was nowhere near over. The reactor was destroyed. The city was emptying. The world knew something had happened. Now came the part that does not fit neatly into the word accident. Chapter 11, the cleanup. After the explosion, Chernobyl became a massive emergency project. Not a repair job. Repair is too clean of a word. You repair a sink, you repair a bike, you repair a hole in drywall before your landlord notices. Reactor 4 was different. Normal was gone. The goal was not to fix the disaster. The goal was to stop it from becoming worse. Helicopters flew over the destroyed reactor and dropped materials into it, trying to reduce the fire and radioactive release. Soldiers, engineers, scientists, miners, drivers, doctors, and cleanup workers were brought in. Many became known as liquidators. It sounds like the name of a machine, or a special forces unit, but it was ordinary people. Men with shovels, men in trucks, men on roofs. Men wearing masks that were not always enough. Men stepping into places where time itself had become dangerous. Because radiation changes the meaning of time. In normal life, 5 minutes is nothing. 5 minutes is waiting for toast. 5 minutes is nothing. But in a high radiation area, 5 minutes can be the difference between a risky job and a lethal one. Some cleanup work had to happen in extremely short bursts. Radioactive debris had landed on roofs near the destroyed reactor. Robots were tried, some failed. Radiation does not care that your robot has a warranty, so humans had to do what machines could not. That sentence should bother us, because cleanup operation sounds organized. It sounds like trucks, schedules, and people in official hats pointing at maps. But sometimes cleanup meant a person running onto a roof, throwing radioactive debris over the side, and getting out as quickly as possible. The whole thing turned time into a currency. Spend too much, and you might not get it back. Then there were the miners. Under the reactor, officials feared that molten material and heat could create even more danger below the destroyed core. So miners were brought in to dig beneath the plant. They worked in brutal conditions, hot, dirty, dangerous. Above them was a destroyed reactor. Around them was a state trying to contain a disaster. Below them was Earth that had to be moved, because sometimes civilization comes down to people with tools doing the job nobody wants to exist. That is the part that makes the cleanup hard to talk about. It was heroic. It was also horrifying. Those two things can be true at the same time. A lot of the people involved did real, necessary work. They prevented wider fires. They cleared radioactive debris. They built barriers. They measured contamination. They evacuated people. They treated the injured. They helped contain something that could have become even worse. But many of them were also exposed to danger because the system had already failed upstream. Heroism often appears where planning failed. That does not make the heroism less real. It just makes the failure harder to ignore. Eventually, a massive concrete and steel structure was built over Reactor 4, the sarcophagus. That word is perfect and terrible, because a sarcophagus is something you build around the dead, and Reactor 4 was dead, but it was not harmless. The structure was built quickly, under awful conditions, to contain radioactive material and reduce the release. It was not a perfect solution. It was an emergency tomb, a giant cover placed over a disaster that was still dangerous underneath. And that is another thing people misunderstand about disasters. The explosion is the scene everyone remembers, but the aftermath is where people keep paying. Hospitals filled with the first victims of severe radiation exposure. Acute radiation syndrome is not mysterious in the cinematic sense. It is worse than mysterious. It is biological. Cells are damaged. Skin burns. The immune system collapses. The body loses its ability to repair itself. Doctors are left trying to treat injuries caused by something no one can see. 2 plant workers died the night of the explosion, or very soon after. 28 emergency workers and plant staff died within the following weeks from acute radiation syndrome. But numbers are tricky, because numbers can make tragedy feel neat, and Chernobyl was not neat. Long-term health effects, cancer risks, evacuations, fear, trauma, contaminated land, political consequences, and broken trust do not fit cleanly into one number. A death toll tells you one part of the story. It does not tell you what it feels like to leave your home forever. It does not tell you what it means for a place to become a warning sign. It does not tell you what happens when a government spends too long pretending reality is smaller than it is. And the more you look at Chernobyl, the clearer the real lesson becomes. The explosion was not the first failure. It was only the loudest one. Chapter 12, The Real Lesson. Chernobyl was a safety test. That is still the part that feels wrong. The test was supposed to prove the reactor could survive a power failure. It was supposed to make the plant safer. Instead, it exposed how unsafe the whole situation had become. By the time the test began, almost every layer of protection had been weakened. The reactor had been delayed. The core had become poisoned by Xenon. Too many rods had been withdrawn. Safety systems had been limited. And the reactor's most dangerous design flaw was waiting for exactly those conditions. The people in the control room did not fully understand how deadly that combination could be. Each fact alone sounds technical. Together, they sound like a door being locked from the outside. That is why the simple blame story does not work. Yes, the operators made mistakes, but they made those mistakes inside a system that made the consequences far worse. A safe system expects people to be tired. It expects people to misunderstand. It expects pressure. It expects bad nights. It expects someone to say, "We are behind schedule." That is what safety is supposed to mean. not a perfect world full of perfect people. A world where imperfect people can make a mistake without a city paying for it. Chernobyl failed that test, and in a strange way, that was the real safety test. Not the turbine coast down, not the pumps, not the backup generators. The real test was whether the whole system could survive human pressure, bad communication, hidden design flaws, and a reactor pushed into a dangerous state. It could not. And once you see that, Chernobyl stops being just a nuclear story. It becomes a human story. Because we do this everywhere, not with reactors, usually. Thankfully. Most of us are not allowed near anything more dangerous than a microwave, and even that feels generous sometimes. But the pattern is familiar. A warning gets ignored because it is inconvenient. A deadline becomes more important than a concern. A system depends on people following rules, but the rules do not match reality. A dangerous flaw is known by some people, but not by the people who need to know. A team keeps going because stopping would be embarrassing. Someone says, just finish it, and everyone hopes the machine will forgive them. But machines do not forgive. Physics definitely does not forgive. Physics is not angry. It is not evil. It is just very consistent. If you create the conditions for a runaway reaction, the reaction does not pause and say, are you sure? This seems like a bad career move. It just happens. That is what makes Chernobyl so terrifying. Not that it was impossible to understand, but that it was understandable. Afterward, once the core was open, once the city was evacuated, once the firefighters were sick, once the world was asking questions, once the truth had become too radioactive to bury. After Chernobyl, RBMK reactors were modified, procedures changed, safety culture changed, international nuclear oversight changed. The disaster forced people to admit what the system had refused to say clearly before. A reactor is not safe because officials say it is safe. It is safe because the design is honest, the operators are trained, the rules match reality, and the people closest to danger are allowed to know the truth. That last part matters, because secrecy is not a safety feature. It feels powerful for a while, it protects reputations, it avoids embarrassment, it keeps the paperwork clean. But secrecy has a habit of moving risk downward. The people at the top keep their image, the people at the bottom get the danger. At Chernobyl, the people in the control room did not have the full picture. The firefighters did not have the full picture. The residents of Pripyat did not have the full picture. And the world only got the picture because radiation crossed a border and refused to keep quiet. That is the part that stays with me. The disaster kept revealing itself to people who were not ready for the truth. First, the operators realized the reactor was not behaving. Then, the plant realized the reactor was destroyed. Then, the firefighters realized this was not a normal fire. Then, Pripyat realized it was not going home. Then, the Soviet Union realized it could not hide what the wind had already carried away. One truth after another, each one arriving too late. So when people ask how a routine test caused the worst nuclear power plant accident in history, the answer is not just they ran the test wrong. That is too small. The better answer is this: the test did not create every problem. It gathered them. It brought the reactor into a dangerous state. It exposed design flaws that were already there. It put tired operators under pressure. It depended on procedures that did not protect them enough. And when the emergency shutdown button was finally pressed, the machine revealed the worst secret of all. The brake had a moment where it acted like gas. That is why Chernobyl is still so disturbing, because it began with a question meant to improve safety. Can we keep the reactor cool if power fails? But underneath that question was another question nobody had honestly answered. What happens if the people running the system do not fully understand the system? Chernobyl answered. Danger does not become safe because it is routine. A checklist does not protect you if the checklist is wrong. A button does not save you if the machine was designed with a secret. And a system does not become trustworthy by hiding the truth. The reactor exploded in seconds. But the disaster was built slowly. In delays. In assumptions. In pressure. In silence. In design choices. In warnings that did not reach the people who needed them. That is the real story of Chernobyl. Not one bad moment. Not one bad person. A whole system treating danger like paperwork until the paperwork caught fire. The reactor is sealed now, the city is still empty, and the people who paid for that night did not get to choose how the story ended. The least we can do is understand it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.